Welcome back.
Morning.
How was your conversation?
Full.
Oh, good.
Yeah, very cool.
Good.
So what if we start with 6,
No.
room 6, simplicity. And here are your reports. And I think our idea was like 5-minute reports, and we'd hear all the reports, take some notes so that you'd have a way to ask questions or make comments or connections after, okay?
Yes. We were
Oh.
in,
Is there anybody from,
yes, I am. Can
Jan.
you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Jan Sanders, group 6. Reporting in. Planet Earth. Planet Earth. Do you hear me? Do you hear me?
We can hear you now.
You can hear me now.
Where
Good.
you been?
Where I've been wondering that. Okay, we are inspired by the quote of Gandhi, to live simply so that others can simply live. We intend to put our resources away from material things into innovation. We talked about innovative seeds for creating the future culture. Okay. We want to have the challenging conversations. We acknowledge painfully the conversations it would take to move in these directions, but we are practicing new conversations. We recognize smaller spaces, the whole smaller home movement, smaller houses movement as a way towards this. If you don't have the space, you can't put the stuff. And so that's beginning to happen. Okay. We also then are appreciate all the different types of simplicity, conscious, voluntary, ecological, and want to hold the tension between voluntary and necessity. And that's the space that we're going to create in. We are complete unless my team would like to add something.
I think the piece about wants is that it isn't wants, but needs. That decisions are made
Okay.
on the basis of needs, not wants.
Mhm. Good.
I think Martin Luther King had a good statement like that there's enough to meet people's need, but not enough to meet their greed.
Mm.
Okay.
somebody from that term team, what's really important about this move towards simplicity? What's the opportunity that's there?
Mm,
I think what the chapter tells us is that the lighter touch we have and begin to develop in our own lives, the more we connect with the non-material things that make life more beautiful for us. So that, and that may be a motivation for the continuing the process of moving away from the concentration on the material to those things that are not material in our lives.
Anything else from team 6?
that's good.
Room 6. Room 5.
Okay, gonna try and summarize our conversation. And our focus was on building community and the challenge to really reweave our social relationships and our sense of community, starting at the very, very local level with what's called pocket neighborhoods, moving up to eco villages, which would be a few hundred people in much more sharing ways, participatory ways, and then to micro communities, which would be sort of the small town level. But sharing much more, raising healthy children takes a village, working more together on these things, having much more common spaces for everything from community gardens to renewable energy microgrids, and workshops for the arts and tools and helping repair things, so on. Our conversation emphasized that the design of a community, how you design it, is critical. And we have examples in some of our immediate surrounding areas, wherever we're from, of lots of new high rises going up, just one right next to the other, right next to the other, and just sort of packing people into condos or apartment buildings without much attention to the commons, or having common spaces in your community building, or ways to bring people together. So the design is important, and keeping the common space as a central part of designing our communities is critical. Secondly, we felt there was that we could easily become insular, and so that it's important to remember how, as we're building from these smaller to these larger, better integrating communities, that we connect with larger life beyond our immediate surroundings, beyond our immediate smaller neighborhoods, and not to look at our communities as a protection from the outside world. Thirdly, we talked about the challenge to how to work through the political divisiveness that we experience now in our country, how to work through that as we're trying to begin to build new and better communities. And maybe not an answer there, but really noting that that's a challenge part of this community building. And then there was the mention of if technology, in terms of the coming collapse that we've talked about earlier, if technology that keeps us connected with other countries and other parts of the world, if that collapses, that would be a big factor in how we need to reconnect and rebuild. And finally, we realize this has to involve a shift from people working out of their head in developing communities to working from their heart. That, as someone said, with the simplicity, going to greater simplicity, we also need to go from our head, knowing, the right engineering and all these things. Not that that's not important, but that we need to go from an ego community to an echo community. We need to move to a heart level to experience the richness of community, which is what we are after. So I don't know, does anyone else on our group have anything you'd like to add? I don't know if that captured it. Anybody?
Captured it.
Okay.
You got it.
Okay. So that was group
Things
5.
in the chat.
Okay. The chat.
Well, that's for me. I was just, as I was listening to you talk,
Mhm.
the image that came in my mind was when ICA was involved in community development in local communities, you were looking at a geographic framework, a non-geographic framework, and a deliberation framework. And those were called stakes and guilds and the community
Right.
decision-making process. Anyway, so what this brings back in, we've been doing a lot of work with communities of practice, which are non-geographic based. And what the environmental need brings back in is that direct vital need for the geographic to be represented, to be woven together. And so I liked your image of reweaving.
Mm-hmm.
I'm complete.
Thank you.
Am I,
Someone else?
Jean Watts, did you have a comment?
You're muted at the moment.
You're muted.
yeah, sorry. All right. Yeah,
Yeah.
I was talking. I was saying that one of the most difficult things, it seems to me, that we will have in building communities, regardless of how we do it. The reason, people get into them for support, for, their own reasons really
Yeah.
help, et cetera. And it's the on half of, we're supporting each other on half of something beyond just those of us within the community. That
Uh,
seems to be the most difficult or challenging part in my mind to be able to figure out how to do, especially in, say, like a high rise, or even in just these experimental senior living communities where, over 50 are living in a supportive environment that keeps the whole problems of loneliness and, so, but how would they act on behalf of those not in their community? The reaching out part beyond it. So it's ego on a social level rather than ego on a personal level here.
I just put your thought in a chat note. Thank you.
It's interesting to me that Larry Feldbrook brought up communities of practice. This building community chapter really focuses on the redesign of physical community away from the sort of suburban pattern that's been so prevalent in this country. And no mention at all about the dimensions of community and support that happen in churches and congregations and clubs and in organizations of various kinds that could certainly warrant some thinking. I'm complete. Anything else on here before we move on to team 2 and communicating?
For those of us connected to the Institute, I know not everybody is, but we probably would do religious houses a little different these days.
Ah,
Like
Yeah.
what?
Say more.
Yeah. We dealt with the economic, we shared our food, we had a mission. There was a lot that would be really cool.
Yeah,
Mm.
we probably would bring the environmental in a little bit more, wouldn't we? That would be an element, one element would be different. But anyhow.
It's one triangle at level 3 on the social process.
Oh, my goodness.
So yes, I think we'd probably bring it in a little differently if we did it today.
But it could be the mission. It could be clear that that's the mission that we need to tackle. Anyway, okay.
I think
How is
also to assume that there's a lot of possible potential communities evolving and developing.
How is this going to provide lift? It feels to me this building community things is just one more overwhelming thing that's not going to change. But how is moving on this going to produce the sort of lift that turns this into a great transition and not just a collapse scenario?
Mm,
Well, I think a lot of work has been going on in building communities,
Yeah.
both, I mean, over the last 30 years, and both both we're particularly in communities of practice. And so I think one of the places is to bring those insights and learnings back into the geographical context, which is sort of in some ways what the reason they've been created was to avoid the geographical. In other words, I don't like my next door neighbor, so I talk to people across the world. But so how do we take those insights and learnings from the communities of practice locally, globally, et cetera, and re-attack, or whatever the right attack is to this
strong.
whole thing about voluntary simplicity. I have a real struggle with at what point, how much are you guys going to let me volunteer, and how much are you going to call me up and say, hey, why aren't you here yet? Anyway, so I'm complete.
Time is fleeting, so let's move on to 2 is communicating.
Okay. The quote that took us was that communication is the lifeblood of democracy. And we added on and saving the earth. It's important for people to be heard, and there'll be some more about that in the next report. That holding mass media accountable so that we're not just getting infotainment. And the fact that there's tech everywhere. You really mentioned, cell phone, internet, all kinds of ways of connecting electronically. And by what, 20, within the, in the end of the next decade, 75% of the world is going to have electronic access to each other. So it's sort of like, why wouldn't we be doing that somehow? But both people and the earth need to be having a voice. That's not been happening. But to have that voice, it's a part of our global nervous system. We did also mention, I think I'll mention that later, about the ETMs. Why is it important? Well, if you're going to develop a consensus for a common direction, you have to communicate. And you're never going to get billions of people engaged without them beginning to talk to each other. In terms of how he talked about there being billions that could then begin to really move something. We also noted that if you're going to hold the media accountable, they are supported by a lot of sponsors. And we've got to go back to those product sponsors and hold them accountable along with the media that they're sponsoring. And what will it take to make it happen? One comment was large movements of insistent people. Either that or a whole new media platform, something besides the one we got. That there needed to be support of and connection of loud organizations like the Extinction Rebellion or Greenpeace and many others. And then electronic town meetings that kick off local action. We did a little bit of talking about getting the youth, finding a way to, what did somebody say, let the youth loose. And so that the sunrise movement could get supported by, well, I call it the sunset population, like us, except for a few of you who are younger. And we talked about schools needing to add some strong curriculum, like how to understand the media, how to bring self-consciousness to what's true and what's not. Teaching more consciousness and looking at things like news and sorting it out, having some critical thinking. Also cutting the reactionary thing that many of us have either done or experienced from others of you see something come across social media and you don't even check, is this true or not? You just pass it on. That's been pretty unhelpful in a lot of ways. But if you could teach young people to really question as a part of their discipline, that would be amazing. And another thing we wanted to do, and this really didn't relate as much to communicating, but to think of all the things that people can do. Well, I guess the idea is communicate those things to people, all the things they can do, and, you know, share that around. And then one of us mentioned that the top 3 things that individuals could do to help with climate mitigation, there were just 3, and recycling was way, way, way down the list somewhere. Was to reduce food waste, do family planning, and have a plant-based diet. Those were the 3 top things that, if those were done across the world, make a big difference. Anything my team wants to add?
What was the third one?
A plant-based diet, but what were the other
Yeah.
two?
Reduce food waste and family planning.
Mhm.
We did have the thought of running, doing posters and running educational programs at libraries, zoos, schools, etc., and bringing joy to the work. So that we're moving forward with the joy and not the gloom and doom.
Can I add one comment?
Mhm.
What we have seen in both Tanzania, east coast of Africa, and in Ghana, west coast of Africa, is that when you educate, especially the girls, to a higher level, that would be either high school graduation or university graduation, the size of the family goes down dramatically. But you know, it just sort of takes care of itself. Family planning does enter into it then. The young women take much more, or first of all, they're more aware of family planning. They're more aware of how to do family planning, and they actually do more family planning. So
Helpful.
If
Yeah.
I may add a comment. The one thing I would add also is the media. You know, we have the media is what's molding the global brain, and right now we have, you know, like take for instance Noam Chomsky's book Manufacturing Consent. It's proven that all the media are basically businesses, and so what's being produced and given to the global brain is something that fits with the paradigm that those who are running the show want us to have. So we need to deal with censorship and fake news. I mean, just imagine if WhatsApp replaced all these anti-vaxxers with messages talking about the dire climate situation. I think everyone would be then on the heels of the politicians saying, hey, what are you doing about this? You know, we've got the Capitol insurrection. If you could get that kind of energy, you know, to force politicians to deal with the climate change, what we need is the removal of the censorship and also the information overload that comes in, you know, along with the fake news. That's my comment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Time marches on. Can we hear from group 1? Group 1.
So this is reconciliation, right? Reconciling. So I took notes and we were going to summarize it, but we didn't. So I'll read through my notes. So there's so much to deal with in reconciling, you know, social, economic, political, ecological. And we sort of started off with Archbishop Tutu from South Africa, that there's really 3 steps that need to happen in reconciling. One is the injured to be heard. The second is the wrongdoers must apologize publicly. And finally, there needs to be a sense of restitution or reparation. That those 3 dynamics are really critical in this whole reconciling dialogue. We also said that it takes an hands on deck. Everyone needs to be part of the process. The key is forgive and to go forward. Oxfam laid out this thing that climate change at its most essential is a justice issue. And we talked about how important it is that and there were some examples of inviting people of color to hear their experience, particularly like the American Indians, learn to reconnect with people and their experiences and to take time to hear their experience and what their life is like. And that's a real part of the reconciling process. We talked about the religious reconciling, and that there has been a lot of examples of interfaith groups forming and beginning to bridge the gaps between different religions and becoming more familiar with each other. Somebody mentioned that that singing together is a real critical area, that we need to talk about the spirit of our lives and see the diversity. Louis Armstrong is a great example of somebody, a person of color, but had great spirit and a great sense of who he was. Somebody asked about what we learned from the Ecumenical Institute and religious houses. It's a great model. It takes some time to get that set up again. But we also talked about reconciling versus blame. And we need to look at systemic injustice that produces inequality. That's a real underlying dynamic of feeling that we're going to be reconciled. And particularly in the area of finances. And we also talked about this sense of clanness and we build borders around our own internal groupings. And we need to get over that. We need to look at how we can reach out more. We talked about the slaves. They were not paid for their labor, but owners did well, not their intention, but have advantages, huge advantages. And the people who were in the fields just didn't have that kind of an advantage. And then somebody mentioned that we need the fire of suffering to be burnt. Means that we have the opportunity to change when there's nothing there anymore, and we have to rebuild to build a society that's equal, and that we can all live in this world. And there were some questions about, is there an example of how the fire has brought about the kind of change that we're talking about in reconciliation? And it was brought up World War I and World War II, the Great Wars. And when the wars were over, the Europeans could see that they could not live separately. And we formed the European Union. They saw the bloodbath that was created by the war and their families torn apart. And they knew it was not worth it. And so this is an example of the kind of suffering that can produce a new sense of oneness of what's going on. We did the Marshall Plan that really helped them. And so we don't have to let things fall apart, but it is part of our great transition. And we see that in like the Black Lives Change already beginning to happen there. We talked about that there's some great examples already of reconciling going on. And we talked about the climate action neighborhoods in Denver and other places that are beginning to build up their community and building up community resilience that deals with reconciling in a really deep way. So building community is a key reconciling dynamic. Anything I missed? Team?
Mm, Wow, wow.
2 or 3 reflection. We visited four places that can give lift in this great transition: community building, communicating, simplicity, and reconciling. What's it going to take? Well, first, what's the opportunity in all this?
Well, the opportunity from the last world wars was the nationalistic walls between European countries were broken.
Mm.
So I think the opportunity when climate change destroys the economic and financial supply lines across the world, it would break down the nationalistic borders between different countries. And hopefully, going forward, nations will not operate from a nationalistic point of view, but try to operate more from an internationalistic economic model, where it is no longer the idea of getting resources and cheap labor, but as a whole community where everyone is considered equally like citizens.
You know, we haven't learned too much from the pandemic experience to bridge that gap. So I'm just wondering what we will have learned, you know, from that to make the bridge to, you know, when climate change becomes an incredible chaos and crisis time. So it's not just wishful thinking that national boundaries will be broken down. They certainly increased during this pandemic, especially in terms of the vaccine distribution and equity.
You know, we mentioned Europe coming together by dropping a lot of their political boundaries. They still have some, but starting with the economic cooperation among 28 nations. But I lived in Europe for a couple of years in Austria, and what I saw when I had a lot of Swedish and Norwegian and other Scandinavian people in my classes, I did a master's degree over there in conflict studies, and the Scandinavian countries, including Iceland, each seem to have adopted a country in Africa that they created a special relationship with about development. That they were sort of the mentor or the cheering section, or I don't know, they helped with all kind of not only economic, but sending teams down, healthcare teams to develop new things and so on. For example, Sweden's partner was Uganda. And not that other European countries didn't help Uganda, but that each European country really had a partner in the developing world that they assumed responsibility for. And I think that's a great model. You know,
Right.
maybe even in our country, we could consider doing something like that by our states, because our states are as big as a lot of countries. But anyway, that's
one more comment and then we'll close, but then we'll come back for our little after session. Who has a different reflection to share?
I was thinking that many of the things we talked about are things that we can do as individuals or as small communities, but a lot of stuff that affects the world has to do with systems that we support, you know, particularly, for instance, economic systems. So the opportunity here, if you look at, if climate, well, as the suffering continues and you see breakups, revolutions, perhaps even the destruction of nations, you know, imagine what would happen if the US broke apart, China doesn't hold as a nation, there's revolutions everywhere. So this overarching political national structures are down. And along with that, if you imagine financial systems break down, banks can't talk to each other, the dollar, the money doesn't have any more power. You know, there's disaster in a sense, but in another way, it's also an opportunity because it opens up everything. You know, it clears the slate for a lot of the stuff that's oppressing people. And the thing is, what I'm seeing is individuals are the ones who support the systems. So what I'm saying is we need to be also thinking of how we support systems, how we support, for instance, the capitalistic systems that destroy resources, that accumulate wealth for certain groups, you know, not only capitalistic systems, but other systems too, you know. And that may become an opportunity when you have a, when all you have are communities on the local level that are trying to survive somehow. They may be the only thing that survives when nations break up, when all these other things break up. So anyway, that's my
Reflection.
here.
Early on, I think it was maybe even before this week's reading, he mentioned about how technology could be picked up though, because we can do so much with technology. And I think that, you know, and also then he mentioned something about the older people are the ones that are going to make the change. And I really disagree with that, because I really am leaning heavily on saying what technology can do, because I've realized, you know, like here we are on Zoom, but if somebody really got into this and shared a dream with a bunch of people that had any kind of power and decided to get people from all over the world to sign in on it, there's going to be a lot of anger that happens from the top, because the top is going to have to fall.
Mm.
The social well-being, the United States is built on commercialism and always want it to be better, and you want to die with being the best of who you are. But that's not what's going to save the world. And I have a grandson who is raising a lot of stink in his family because they don't agree with him. And yet he's very intellectual and he knows how to do all kinds of things with computers. And I could see him as one of those that just sort of implements. You somehow have to get the dream of possibility to where the power is.